freedom land on another great day of resistance. Today, I will be honoring and commemorating those great freedom fighters, those great African ancestors who chose to rise up on this date of Easter Sunday, 1817, in the southern plantations in the southern lands of Maryland, in the county of St. Mary's, where over 200 enslaved Africans would rise up against the capitalist state of Maryland and its government. I also will be commemorating what I know as the Republic of Maryland that was carved out of the West African country of Liberia, where enslaved peoples and free peoples of Maryland immigrated to that part of West Africa. The history of the state of Maryland and its system of slavery, we know began in the early periods of times of the early 1600s when the British Empire was colonizing those lands. We also know the state of Maryland has heavy ties to Virginia because Maryland used to be a part of Virginia at one point in period of time. We know that the three main ethnic groups that were brought to the state of Maryland during the transatlantic slave trade came from three specific areas in West Africa. They came from Igbo land, Mende land, and they also came from the Angolian land of Angola. Also brought to that land was also the Yoruba peoples that came from West Africa as well. Also, the Mandinka tribe was brought to Maryland in that period of time. One of those infamous slave peoples was Kunta Kinte from Gambia, the land of Mandinkas. We also know that there's an important date and year for the first enslaved peoples that was brought to the state of Maryland. We know that the first 13 enslaved Africans was brought to Maryland in the year 1642. Over 100,000 enslaved peoples will be brought to the state of Maryland. We also know that the colonization of those lands was led by Lord Baltimore, aka Charles Calvert, hence perhaps where the city of Baltimore got its name from. We also know that the number one crop that was being cultivated in the state of Maryland was the crop of tobacco, which also was the number one crop being cultivated in the state of Virginia. Tobacco was making so much money in the state of Maryland that they imported large amounts of peoples from the west coast of Africa and the Caribbean islands to the state of Maryland and to the Chesapeake area of Maryland. Slave resistance movements and slave rebellions of the state of Maryland is something that's rarely talked about. We know that one of the earliest slave rebellions in history took place on this day, Easter, but it was Easter Monday of 1817, where over 200 enslaved African freedom fighters organized and met up at a store near a plantation called St. Ingo's in St. Mary's County, Maryland. These 200 enslaved African peoples would rise up against the capitalist state of Virginia and try to overthrow the government of the state of Maryland in that point in period in time. Unsuccessful in this slave rebellion, most of these enslaved peoples were captured, hung, executed, and many of them were sold into slavery for life. And many of them were sold to the deeper southern states for more harsh punishment. Another great slave rebellion that would be influenced by the Easter Rebellion of 1817 came in the year 1845 in the month of July, that was led by the great freedom fighters Mark Caesar and Bill Wheeler, who led over 75 armed Africans up against the capitalist state of Maryland, who was trying to get to the free state of Pennsylvania at that point in period in time. We also know that these slave rebellions in Maryland had a heavy effect on the Civil War as well. Maryland would not succeed from the Union and join the Confederate States, but Maryland in the southwestern part and the southern part of Maryland were sympathetic to the Confederate States of Maryland that would spark more slave resistance and more slave rebellions in the state of Maryland. There was one more slave rebellion that inspired all these slave rebellions in the state of Maryland. We go back to the year 1739, where over 200 enslaved Africans was planning, plotting, strategizing to take over Prince George County, Maryland, that would lead to other several rebellions in the 1750s in Somerset County, Maryland. All these slave rebellions in Maryland has one thing in common with the struggle of black peoples and enslaved peoples in America, the struggle for independence and an independent nation, which leads to the Republic of Maryland, where the Colonization Society of Maryland would set up a mission to move enslaved African peoples back to the west coast of Africa, because so many slave rebellions and slave resistance was taking place in the state of Maryland and other parts of the deeper South. So in 1834 to 1857, the Maryland Colonization Society would set up land in the west coast of Africa that would become Liberia one day. It was named the Republic of Maryland, where referendums, elections, independence, so free peoples and slave peoples, immigrated back to that area in droves of numbers, where in May 1854, these enslaved peoples and free peoples that migrated to the Republic of Maryland would declare independence in 1854. Several other movements would transpire after that, where we see that land and territory was set up for enslaved peoples. You had the Republic of Mississippi, the Republic of Kentucky, the Republic of Georgia, Louisiana, and also the Republic of New Jersey that was being talked about. So as you see, these enslaved peoples was fighting for something more important than anything: sovereignty, independence, and land, and restoring their dignity. So on this day, we honor those who rose up on Easter 1817 in the state of Maryland. Long live the resistance, long live the freedom fighters. Free the land by any means necessary.